Acknowledgments. Love for the Divine Comedy was instilled in me at a relatively early age by the efforts of some very fine teachers. All the way back in high school, we were introduced to large excerpts from the Inferno by enterprising young teachers. University and graduate school cemented the connection. At Cornell College in the Western Civilization program with William Carroll, I was guided through the complete comedy for the first time. Ashley Crandall Amos of the Pontifical Institute of Medieval Studies in Toronto encouraged me to investigate the fascinating structures in Dante's work in her vernacular literature course. She pushed me at the time to publish the findings, but it had taken me well over 35 years to take her kind advice. I wish I could have spoken with her about this subject. May she rest in peace. I thank also the members of my community. It has been said that raising a child takes a village, but it's certainly true that forming a seminarian takes a community. In their different ways, they all contribute to the success of the seminary through teaching, spiritual direction, and the myriad tasks that make housing and feeding dozens of people possible. Without their support, I could not have completed this book. I remember with gratitude the seminarians of St. Philip's Seminary. They were the original inspiration for teaching a course on the Inferno. They have forced me to rethink and clarify my thoughts in a way nothing but a classroom of students can do for me. I could not have written this commentary except as a byproduct of our debates in class and our discussions in my office. Many of them have provided materials about Dante and encouraged me about publishing this text. I hope they understand what an important part they have played in the formation of this text and in the day-to-day happiness of my life. Throughout the years, I have made use of a great number of wonderful translations of the Divine Comedy. Dante's work has drawn the attention of some amazingly talented translators, and each one has brought something beautiful and splendid to the wonderful task of reading Dante. It is an exercise in literary wonder to read and compare their attempts to capture the dignity of the music of Dante's verse. Dorothy Sayers, John Sinclair, Mark Musa, Alan Mandelbaum, and even the Naxos recording of the Divine Comedy read aloud have all had a regular place in our classroom. Their renderings of the text and their notes have inspired and guided us along the way. But special thanks must go to Anthony Uselin. Since his translations have appeared, they have been the text of choice for our seminaries. This clarity and spiritual sensitivity have been a great gift to us. The references I make within the text to Dante's words are almost always to Uselin's fine translation. Readers could do no better than to have it open beside them as they make their way through this book, reading Dante's text a little at a time while reading these commentaries along with it. Knowing my hesitations about writing, God seems to have provided an almost embarrassing crowd of friends to support and push me. Several of them have read the text in one version or another, and thank you to my very first readers, Veronica and Bill, Donna and Danielle in particular. It took an entire family to get me photographed, and the Wojciechowski family helped me to overcome my discomfort by their friendship and good humor. Their work was a complete family effort. And getting the text ready for publication is a long process. It began in earnest with Father Juvenal Mariel, providing suggestions and corrections for me. I especially appreciate his keen historical mind and scriptural knowledge. He put me on the right track on many occasions. My own feeling overwhelmed at the idea of presenting a book for publication left me rather paralyzed. The text was relatively complete, but I had nothing about a good publisher. I'd done nothing. Another Oratorian confrere came to the rescue. Father Daniel Utrecht, the author of the very important The Lion of Munster, was my literary matchmaker, introducing me to his editor at Tan Books, John Morehouse. John has been generous and understanding about calming my first-time anxieties. He has made this process as painless as possible. At times, it has been very enjoyable. My final thanks go out to a man named Dante Alighieri. His work is still bearing fruit after 700 years. When reading this text, I know I am in the presence of a literary giant, but, even more important to me, also an intensely serious Christian soul. Here is a man firmly dedicated to getting his soul to heaven and to bringing all of us along with him. There is no greater work than that. Introduction. A list of great books, classics, that every educated person should have read, can seem inspiring at first. We might think to ourselves, ah, here is my intellectual project for the next few years, a way of enriching my mind in the privacy and comfort of my own home. Perhaps we begin at the top of the list chronologically with Homer, or perhaps we look for something we think might be a gentler intellectual warm-up for our minds, unaccustomed as they are now, if they ever were, to such exertion. But the list is impressively and intimidatingly long one. If the size of the list is not enough to discourage one from the beginning, the difficulties presented by a text from a very different culture and distant age can seem daunting. I found it so much easier to attack these great works as a student. Was that merely because I was younger then? Or was it because I had a guide to explain the difficulties and classmates with whom I could discuss my own perceptions while I was compelled to listen to theirs? For many people, the wholesome project of making one's way through the classics is often set aside. Not exactly rejected, but put on some sort of permanent hold. Many people would place Dante's Divine Comedy on their list of great books. Dante is someone we really should read. He is, by all reports, one of the literary greats the human race has produced, not to mention one of the founding fathers of Italian literature. So why have we not read this greatest work yet? What is it that holds us back? The reasons a modern reader might hesitate to pick up the Divine Comedy are subtle and varied. The first amounts to a sort of intellectual inferiority complex. We absolve ourselves from reading this unquestionably great work by telling ourselves that reading an epic poem written 700 years ago about something so dry and dire as hell is obviously something best left to the experts. Like many things that we're told are good in themselves, perhaps reading Dante should come with the warning, do not try this at home. Specialists in medieval studies or in literature or Florentine history or even theology are welcome to slog their way through the text, but it would be wasted on me, so the little voice inside us might say. But there is something true in what that little voice says. There is certainly enough in the Divine Comedy to keep several different graduate departments of many universities busy indefinitely. For the 700th anniversary of the completion of the Divine Comedy, most specialists will undoubtedly be very busy, adding to the impressive collection of serious intellectual work already dedicated to Dante. He might have ended his life in exile from his homeland, but he has been treated with enormous respect and veneration by armies of scholars around the world. But the truth is that Dante did not write his Divine Comedy primarily for specialists. He wrote for a much wider audience, an audience as broad as the church itself. He wrote it for anyone serious about the spiritual life. He wrote it for anyone interested in going to heaven, but aware of his own limitations and failings. It is a work of amazing complexity, but it is also very direct and immediate, communicating truths from one struggling soul to another. Dante sees himself not only as a literary craftsman, theologian, political philosopher, and crusader for justice, although he is definitely all of those things. But more fundamental than those secondary roles, Dante presents himself as a sort of spiritual everyman, a pilgrim who represents each one of us on the journey he takes. What he is experiencing on his pilgrimage is something common to us all. His struggles will be familiar to the everyday people for whom he writes. He wants to inspire serious believers to follow him on the road to conversion. Inspiring literary scholars to write articles in books is not enough. He consciously takes up the task of converting hearts and changing lives. If only scholars read his work, he's fallen tragically short of his goal. Dante at least hints at his spiritual mission in the opening line of the Inferno that starts with, "Midway upon the journey of our life." What he is going through is not something particular to him. It is part of the human condition. He's not undertaking the journey of his own life only, but the journey of our life. The lessons he learns are intended for us as well, and the benefits he receives on the way and the promises made to him belong to us too. But Dante's special mission to lead others on the spiritual path he himself has traveled is more than something we glean from his opening words. Dante reports that it was entrusted to him by none other than St. Peter himself in his account of his journey through paradise. These are the words St. Peter spoke to him. Quote, "And seeing the truth about this company, comfort yourself and others with hope's power. Hope that on earth stirs love for the true good." Unquote. Dante is to take his experience of hell, purgatory, and the blessedness of heaven back to earth to kindle in his own heart and the hearts of his readers a desire and hope to share in that blessedness themselves. He's been granted his journey both for his own conversion and salvation, but also for his training as a sort of missionary of heavenly hope. Dante intends this book for you. It will not be over your head, but it will challenge your heart. Many contemporary Christians would hesitate to read the Inferno for a second, more theological reason. The very notion of eternal punishment seems, at first glance, to contradict our image of a loving and merciful God, because, as many modern thinkers like to tell themselves, they have moved well beyond the medieval notion of divine vengeance. In the modern worldview, God's merciful love and the eternal punishments of hell do not seem to be reconcilable, and so, in our society, we hear less and less about even the possibility of hell. Catholics seem to give an ever-increasing amount of attention to eschatology, being death, judgment, heaven and hell. We seem to be losing the tradition of praying for the souls of the dead. Praying for them implies that there is an uncertainty about the spiritual state of death and after death, an uncertainty that we are not ready to admit. Many people seem to assume that death means immediate entry into heaven, and so when people die, eulogies are given that celebrate their lives, and masses are celebrated in white to tell us that we should be confident in the resurrection. We develop an ever-increasing list of euphemisms for death to allow us to avoid even naming the reality. People no longer die, they merely pass. Death is an unwelcome subject. Reading an entire book about eternal judgment might seem unspeakably foreign and even distasteful to a contemporary Christian, and might call all of these comfortable modern assumptions into question. But perhaps a questioning of these assumptions is not necessarily a bad thing. What if the societal shifts in focus are not healthy theological developments, but rather defense mechanisms for avoiding difficult truths? Our Lord himself, the bringer of the good news, is the source of most of the references to hell and eternal punishment in Scripture. This is not something later Christians invented. It goes back to Christ himself. He came to us to offer the possibility of salvation, to put before us the choice between life and death. He comes in a spirit of forgiveness so that we can escape an eternity of unhappiness, but only if we are willing to accept that forgiveness and turn away from what separates us from him. Believing in a merciful and loving God does not eliminate the possibility of judgment or of eternal punishment. God offers us the opportunity for a loving relationship with him, a gift almost impossible to imagine. But a loving relationship is not really a relationship if it's one-sided. It requires a reciprocity of mutual love. There is no question that God desires our salvation. The question is whether we desire it. It would be horrible to imagine a universe created by a God who cared nothing for us. But it is horribly sad to consider a world in which God's creatures seem to care so little for him or for themselves. We seem willing to jeopardize our relationship with him for a passing pleasure. We seem willing to gamble our own happiness on things which we know, at least deep down, will not satisfy. Dante clearly believes in God's merciful love. In his understanding, eternal punishment is not something imposed by God, as though he were spending all eternity hurling pain and vengeance upon unfortunate souls. Dante's depiction of hell is surprisingly free of the stock pictures of punishment being inflicted. There are almost no devils with pitchforks in the Inferno, and when they do appear, they provide a sort of comic relief. The horrible sadness of hell resides not so much in the various punishments themselves. What really hurts is the fact that they are self-imposed by souls who choose to hold on to their sins rather than accept the wonderful offer of divine love. The punishment of hell arises from our rejection of God, not his rejection of us. It is twisted desire that inflicts the pain, not God. He is constantly intervening to encourage us to escape into his merciful arms. The subject matter itself will provide a third reason for some people to avoid reading the Inferno. Reading a book about souls who suffer forever in hell might seem to indicate a morbid fascination with death and eternal punishment, a twisted and tortured psychology. But morbid fascination is certainly not an element of Dante's personality. He was no narrow-minded, scrupulous religious fanatic. He spent the first part of his life deeply involved in politics, which earned him exile, and writing love poetry. He is a man of great personal balance and shockingly clear psychological insights that most modern readers would never expect from a medieval author. Dante does not write Inferno so that his readers can indulge in a voyeuristic tour in which the reader is invited to stare at those sinners down there with their horrible but definitively inventive sufferings. In his narrative, there is nothing of the smug self-congratulation that we often associate with the morally doctrinaire. Dante writes for a much more hopeful reason. He is convinced that the sufferings of hell are really just a distillation or permanent snapshot of the natural byproducts of sin. Side effects we already begin to experience here in this life. What we see there is a revelation of the true nature of sin once its alluring disguise is stripped away. As a result, Inferno is not merely about them, it is about us. And it is not only about the way we might be someday, it reveals the way we are right now. Dante's descriptions of the torments of hell are a spiritual and psychological reflection on the twistedness of sin, a twistedness that causes us to suffer terribly, but often in an unexpected and hidden way. These offerings might seem to arise from nowhere or from the very fabric of human existence, making our life seem desperate and the search for happiness futile. If suffering is somehow built right into life, then we can hope for nothing better than what we already have. This messed up world is as good as it gets. We are left with human life that seems to correspond with Thomas Hobbes' famously distressing formulation: solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Identifying a cause of the suffering that is so obvious in our world, as Dante attempts to do here, is not morbid. It is hopeful. Once the source of the pain is located, there exists the hope of a cure. Diagnosis precedes treatment. If the life of sin brings with it the necessary side effect of suffering, then the life of virtue holds out to us the promise of a true and enduring happiness. Dissecting the psychology of sin is part of Dante's message of hope. Life can be different because we can be different, if only we choose to get back on the path of virtue. But all of these justifications for not reading the Inferno are based upon a misrepresentation of Dante's intention. The modern reader who steers clear of Dante is doing so most probably because he is missing Dante's point, a point he declares in his choice of title, Divine Comedy. Many modern readers will hear the word comedy and expect something funny, but the classical understanding of comedy is both broader and deeper. According to the dramatic tradition that dates at least from the ancient Greeks, drama happens in two distinct forms that follow different trajectories. One sort begins with a seemingly idyllic and peaceful scene that appears stable and secure, but falls apart because of some hidden flaw or injustice. This is tragedy, the story of the disintegration of human happiness. But there is another sort of drama, one that begins with what appears to be a horribly complicated mess. There is little hope of any resolution of these difficulties. The characters are almost stuck in their situations, with something apparently immovable impeding the possibility of their happiness. But something happens, often an unexpected intervention that almost miraculously unravels the knots. The happiness that seemed impossible is now a reality. And this is comedy. When Dante chooses to call his poem a comedy, he is informing the readers of what he thinks can be the trajectory of our lives. We begin in the mess of our fallen human nature, a mess further complicated by our own history of hurts and of our own personal sins. We get so entangled that we can despair of ever finding our way to freedom. We can find it difficult to even imagine being free. We are stuck in our mess. But an intervention happens. In a general way, this assistance from outside is an image of God's grace at work in our souls, most particularly through his entry into our world through the incarnation. He brings with him new power and new possibilities. But this acting in our world is very particular as well. Each one of us is being showered with graces. Each one of us is being supported by the prayers and good works of the angels and saints. The heavenly kingdom is working together, almost conspiring for our salvation. With this awareness of the infinite power and support of heaven, we can enter into our spiritual life with an attitude completely transformed. Everything is possible, even our becoming saints. If Dante's poem is truly a comedy, it is less about hell itself than about the wonderful escape that God has planned for each of us. The mess of our lives need not be permanent. We are not doomed to a life without joy. But for the comedy to unfold properly, we need to step enthusiastically into our role. We must accept God's offer of forgiveness and turn away from the disordered attachments that stand in the way of our happiness, both here and forever. At first, Dante surveyed the ruin of his life, an exile, stripped of his possessions and his reputation, and saw nothing but tragedy. Everything he had, he seemed to have lost. He neither saw the cause of his own bitterness, nor had the desire to detach himself from it. It took a heavenly intervention and a trip through hell to turn his life around. He writes of his journey in the hope that our paths can be diverted too. He invites us to come with him on this journey, to look at the ugly cause of human bitterness, and to discover the way out of our pain. He is recalling the crisis every soul must encounter. He wants us to know that there is a way out of the dark wilderness in which we find ourselves, and we too can discover the comedy scripted for us from all eternity. Welcome to the journey. Signed, Paul Pearson of the Oratory in Toronto, on the Feast of Our Lady of the Most Holy Rosary, October 7th, 2018.